this series on screwball comedy. It's one of my favorite genres, that and I think film noir, and just an extraordinary way to look at a certain period of history in America and what was happening. So it's very much like other things we've discussed, influenced by the cultural events that were going on. And what we've done here is not taken the traditional most famous screwball comedies, but we've perhaps chosen some that maybe you haven't heard of. Obviously, It Happened One Night, and and there are many ones probably My Man Godfrey. Some of these may be a little more obscure, but they're all classics, and they all have something different that will reveal, something about how this genre evolved over time. So, this all really started, of course, back in sort of 1929 with the Great Depression, right? And that was an extraordinary thing. And it didn't just affect America, it affected, the entire world. And the bank runs, that started then, and then even through 1931 and 1932, 1933, it kept going on. Factories were being closed everywhere. Unemployment got to 25% in America. And of course, the problem was that everyone had borrowed money to put in the stock market in the 20s. Sound familiar? Over $8.5 billion was out on loan, which was more than the entire amount of currency circulating in the United States at the time. So when it crashed and the stock market crashed, it crashed bad. And of course, at that time, everything was on a gold standard. So you weren't able to expand the money supply, and that just continued to make the problem worse. And it really wasn't until the beginning of World War II and the mobilization, that really allowed the American economy to escape the Great Depression for good. And if you know people who were sort of living during that time, and my father was one of them, he's 97, it had a very profound effect on people. And even years and years later, my father and mother were always so conservative about money because it really taught them something. It was traumatic, not unlike what we're going through ourselves with the pandemic, and it had a lasting effect. And that, of course, nowadays, people don't even remember, but that's what it was. Now, what's very interesting, of course, is that during this period, the film industry had its greatest time ever. More people went to movies, more people enjoyed movies, everybody needed an escape, and there's never been a time where there had been a greater percentage of people going to the movies. And it wasn't just movie palaces, but this was a time when a lot of neighborhood theaters were being built, right? Just because there was such a demand for movie theaters. Not unlike the Westdale, which was built in 1935 and probably showed a lot of these films. And often these neighborhood theaters were in the center of the neighborhood, like in Westdale Village. And in Canada, 60% of Canadians went to the movies once a week, right? And comedies, a good laugh, to ease the mind, to bring some joy in a time of diversity. And movies that sort of showed how America was fighting against the Great Depression became very, very popular. And it really was the only diversion there was, because, there was radio, but there really wasn't much else. And all these other industries were struggling like crazy. But it turned out this was a really triumphant time in the movie industry in the 1930s, right? In America, it was 60 to 70 million people went to the movie theater every week. And of course, it only cost 15 cents. And you got a main feature, you had a B movie, you had the newsreel. A famous quote, of course, from President Franklin Roosevelt, during the Depression, when the spirit of the people is lower than any other time, it's a splendid thing that for just 15 cents, an American can go to a movie, look at the smiling face of a baby, and forget his troubles. So now there were all sorts of comedies, of course, but the screwball comedy, which is sort of a subgenre of the romantic comedy, originated during this time. And besides just being an escapist theme, often these movies were emphasized the upper classes and sort of made fun of the upper classes, and often would try to in some way help people not just escape and enjoy what these upper classes were experiencing and what their lives were like, but also kind of, cut them down to size. It made us realize that they were no different than any of us. It Happened One Night, of course, is a classic where you see the wealthy heiress meet the working man and their, and how they actually learned from each other, etc. And the other thing about the screwball comedies that's so interesting is they had to deal with the issue of the Hays Code. And I know I've mentioned this before, the production code and censorship, which really started to come on strong in 1934. And so the directors had, and the writers had to be very clever about how they presented sex and love and any kind of, moral issues, because they were, trying so hard to succeed. The great scholar William K. Everett, screwball comedies were not so much rebelling against the production code as they were attacking and ridiculing the dull, lifeless respectability that the code insisted on for family viewing. Now, of course, there are antecedents for this in the theatrical genre. You would have called this farce, right? Slapstick, existed at the time, bedroom farce. Andrew Sarris, of course, calls the screwball comedy a sex comedy without the sex. Often you'd see stories of cross-dressing. Very often they would be romantic triangles that had to be, undone. Again, men in lower social classes than the women. But it was a cultural escape, but it was a safe battleground on which to explore sometimes serious issues under a comedic and non-threatening framework, right? So all of this made for some very interesting films. And again, what I was most interested in, of course, is how it satirized the traditional love story. And very often, in fact, you'll see a female protagonist who sort of dominates the relationship with a male central character and whose masculinity is being challenged. So it was a new way to think about the battle of the sexes and have fun spoofing love, but at the same time, often there was some real, morals and values that were being presented in a very positive way. Another feature of screwball comedies is that everybody talked fast. In fact, Howard Hawks, who's a director you'll see with 20th Century, our next film, he also directed His Gal Friday. Now that's another classic screwball comedy that we're not doing as part of this. Many people have probably seen it. And the only direction he ever gave the actors in that movie after they did a take was, now do it again and talk faster. And you'll often notice in screwball comedies that people don't walk anywhere. Everybody's running all the time, running up the stairs, running down the stairs. It's just something about the energy and speed of these movies is quite wonderful. And screwball comedies, of course, didn't end, in the 40s. They continued. Even now, you'll see some. One. In fact, we're going to be watching one from 1972, What's Up, Doc, which is a tribute to screwball comedies. But if you think of movies like Fish Called Wanda, or some of the Coen brother movies, or there was even a movie a little while ago called Game Night, these are all movies that were definitely influenced by the screwball comedy genre. And with this movie, of course, Trouble in Paradise, this is 1932. This is before the code. You couldn't possibly have made this movie after the code. In fact, so much of this movie is about sex. It was done so subtly at the time, that it was fine. But when they attempted to re-release the film in 1935, the production code didn't allow them. The studio was not permitted to re-release the movie because, of course, the themes and the way things were addressed in the film. And in fact, it really starts with the opening credits, right? Because you see the words trouble in, and then a bed, and then the word paradise. I don't know if you noticed this, but right from the very beginning, it's telling you, what is going to happen. Of course, Ernst Lubitsch, the great director, we're going to talk quite a bit about him, was behind all of this. But what an amazing cast. Miriam Hopkins, Kay Francis, Herbert Marshall, and often screwball comedies were known for their fantastic supporting casts. And of course, here we have Everett Horton, who appeared in so many of these, and Charles Ruggles, etc. And very typically, again, this is a romantic triangle. And it was actually based on a play. There was a 1931 play, actually it was a Hungarian play, called The Honest Finder in English. And Ernst Lubitsch knew about this play. He had optioned the rights, and this was sort of the inspiration, the basic, theme of the three, of the romantic triangle that he then adapted with a wonderful screenwriter named Sam Raphaelson. Now, Lubitsch, of course, was born in Germany. He was born in Berlin. And he was very famous, of course, for his urbane comedies of manners, as they would describe it. Very elegant films, sophisticated films. And his films became so well known that they actually coined a phrase, a publicist coined it originally, called the Lubitsch touch. And this was just to market the movies, but many critics and many people began to realize there was a Lubitsch touch, and which influenced many filmmakers to come. And we'll talk a little bit about how and examples of what this Lubitsch touch was. But other films that you may or may not know, besides Trouble in Paradise, that he directed, were Designed for Living, Ninotchka, which starred Greta Garbo and was written by Billy Wilder. The Shop Around the Corner, which we had talked about before. To Be or Not to Be, which is a movie we were desperate to do, but we couldn't find it available for everybody, with Jack Benny and Carol Lombard. And if you can find that film, I strongly recommend it. And of course, he never won an Academy Award for Best Directing, but he did win an Honorary Academy Award in 1946. He was born a poor Jewish family. His father was a tailor. He didn't want to be a tailor. He joined Max Reinhardt's famous theater in 1911, and he was an actor. He actually did quite well as an actor. He must have been in over 30 films as an actor between 1912 and 1920. And eventually he did, become a director. And he made these silent films in Germany. But in 1921, one of his films was already chosen, Carmen, as one of the 10 most important films of the year. He was only 29 years old. And he did come to America in 1921 because he wanted to see what was going on. But at the time, the Germans were not so well appreciated. He went back. He dallied back and forth. Finally, Mary Pickford actually chose to sign him for a contract, and he came back to LA and then never left. Although the film Rosita was a big success, he never got along with her, so he broke his contract. Wound up making an incredible deal with Warner Brothers. He did 6 pictures in 3 years, where he even had final cut. And a lot of these silent films are just fantastic. The Lady Windermere's Fan, So This Is Paris, The Student Prince. Often when the sound first began in 1929, he would do musicals, The Love Parade with Maurice Chevalier and Jeanette MacDonald. He got an Academy Award nomination for that one. And he was really, at the top of his game. In fact, at one point he was teaching at the University of Southern California. And later, in the late 30s, Paramount actually made him the head of production, and he supervised all the films they were making. And probably the only time that an actual filmmaker was ever head of a studio in terms of supervising films. But this film, Trouble in Paradise, as I mentioned, was a play he found, and of course, worked on with Sam Raphaelson, and again, it was sort of a truly amoral film. If you think about, what is it about with these two thieves and con artists and everybody having sex with everybody. And, this is something, of course, that could have never been made any other way. So one of the reasons, of course, that he became so successful was he was very experienced and he was very brilliant in creating the detail and blueprint for a film that was absolutely precise. I mean, of all the directors, maybe only Hitchcock, who's very famous, of course, for having storyboarded every shot of his movie before it even started shooting, had the same kind of approach to pre-planning. And so it's interesting that Hitchcock worked in comedies, but they're often compared to each other in terms of their style. And in fact, when it came to the actors, Lubitsch, of course, being an actor, was very precise about what the actors should do. In fact, he would act out every single person's part for them and show them exactly how he wanted them to move, how they should put a coat on, how they should talk. Again, some of the actors actually did not find that so helpful and resisted it a little bit. But what it did do was it created sort of a unified style in terms of the performances, and not just within that film, but within all his films. So when they talk about the Lubitsch touch, some of it does have to do with this kind of, acting style. It was always elegant, but ribald, sophisticated, earthy, urbane and bemused, frivolous, yet profound. Lubitsch was a guy who was amused by sex. He wasn't frightened by it like a lot of the American public was. And he was really trying to teach a culture to be amused by it as well. And these movies always took place in, I don't know, it wasn't Europe, it wasn't America, it was like Lubitsch land. It was his own made up idea of where these movies took place, right? And his own kind of approach to it. So, again, when you watch these movies now, sometimes the work can appear a little dated because there's sort of a formality to the sexual protocol. But I think, certainly at the time, he was way ahead of everybody. And again, it was totally out of time. It was taking place in this unique world. And of course, many actors are the ones who become the best directors. If you think about Elia Kazan or Clint Eastwood or Robert Redford, because when you think of what a director does, the primary thing he does is work with actors, right? There's a camera department, there's a wardrobe department, all these different departments. But I remember when I was working with Francis Coppola, he always said, well, where's the acting department? It's the most important thing going on in the movie. And there's no acting department. All there is the director who's trying to make all the other decisions and also direct the actors. So it's not surprising that some of the best directors were ones who were previously actors. So again, so many interesting aspects of what he was doing in terms of how I could just read quotes on and on. He was so suave, cynical, sophisticated, smooth, and sure that a lifetime is hardly enough to achieve such polish. His actors would glide through the movie, often three characters, like we have in this one, right? The two con men, Herbert Marshall, Miriam Hopkins, and then Kay Francis as the rich widow, taking place in a movie world of exquisite costumes and flawless grooming and butlers and grand hotels and penthouses and cocktails and evening dress and nightclubs and opera and always lots of jewelry, So imagine again, the poor, people suffering through the Depression. What an incredible escape to go visit this world, have some laughs, experience something completely outside of their own world, right? So, and again, one of the things that was clear, certainly in this movie, is let's not confuse sex for love. Sex is a wonderful thing in itself, and love may or may not have to be part of it. Here both the women, Lily and Mariette, they know what they want, and Gaston knows that he has it, and it's his own feelings for them are sort of masked behind this, this veneer of sophisticated banter. But I think it's pretty clear what's going on in the movie, even if we don't see a lot of nudity or anything like that. And this was kind of different for the American public, right? The opening scene where Lily and Gaston first meet, is just full of these brilliant lines, and as you know, how they both are con artists pretending that they're royalty and stealing each other's wallets, and of course Lily says to him, when I first saw you, I thought you were American, and Gaston says, thank you, very very gravely, as if this is a great compliment, and someone from another world, so entirely different. Oh, one gets so tired of one's own class, princes and dukes and kings, everybody talking shop, And of course, they'd kiss, and meanwhile, it turns out, it's almost like they're playing strip poker or something. One's stealing, from the other all this time, and then of course, when they find out who the other is, they become, such a fantastic pair. But again, once it's time to do their work, and Gaston meets Mariette, that becomes the quest, right? To steal the purse, and finding all these different ways. And of course, the dialogue again is full of these insinuations. If I were your father, which fortunately I'm not, and you made any attempt to handle your own business affairs, I would give you a good spanking, in a business way, of course. What would you do if you were my secretary? The same thing. You're hired. I mean, this is just absolutely brilliant stuff. And of course, it just gets hotter and hotter after that. But at the same time, of course, it's always a little underplayed. It's not as one might do today, where they're telling jokes, but they're sort of toying with each other. They're in on the joke. Mariette is not a spoiled rich woman, or she's not a naive victim. She's a sophisticated woman. She has appetites. She has an imagination. She's taking advantage of this opportunity. I don't think she really believes anything this man is saying to her. He's always smiling, even when he lies. So he's letting everyone in on it. This is a bit of a joke, but, and of course, he likes her even as he deceives her. So it's very sophisticated stuff, quite wonderful. I don't know that there are a lot of movies that have this many layers being done anymore. What else? Lubitsch touch, again, it's this idea that it's comic material, but it's being given a dignity by the actors, right? They have a weight of experience behind them. As Andrew Sarris says, a counterpoint of poignant sadness during a film's gayest moments. And if you think about the ending, when Gaston and Mariette are saying goodbye for the last time, and it's clear that, to both of them, that he really did love her, but he also stole from her. And he was, and he was really, in a, had kinship with Miriam Hopkins, with Lily, and who he meant to be with. And they both kind of make a joke of it. There's no tragedy here. There's no one being taken advantage of. Right? So all of this style, we constantly see, he's famous, of course, for holding onto a closed door while, some silent or barely overheard crisis is playing out. And there's always that kind of delicacy and good taste, right? And you feel like the director has this affection and respect for these people, right? And often they're fighty and frivolous, and and they're playing out all these crazy charades, but we care about them. Even the silly side characters like Edward Everett Horton and Arthur Ruggles. His impact on American movies was extraordinary. Jean Renoir said Lubitsch invented the modern Hollywood. And he felt his influence was everywhere, and not just with Billy Wilder and some of the other Germans, who worked with him. But even, as I mentioned, Hitchcock. If you think of Hitchcock's movie To Catch a Thief, it certainly, I bet, was somewhat inspired by this movie, Trouble in Paradise, as Cary Grant and Grace Kelly as jewel thieves who are trying to, get along. So finally, at Lubitsch's funeral, he died in 1947, quite young, and he was very good friends. Billy Wilder and William Wyler were walking to their car, and Wilder finally broke the silence, saying, "No more Lubitsch," and Wyler answered, "Worse than that, no more Lubitsch films." Sam Raphaelson, the screenwriter, worked on many films with Lubitsch. Raphaelson is, of course, particularly well known because he was not a writer, actually. He was a successful advertising executive in New York. And just for fun, he wrote a short story called The Day of Atonement. Raphaelson had grown up Jewish in a very religious Orthodox family. And he dictated this short story, and she was so excited about it. She wanted him to try to turn it into a play. And of course he did. And that play became a screenplay. And it was The Jazz Singer in 1929, the very famous and probably the first talking picture with Al Jolson. This is the same writer, Sam Raphaelson. And then, of course, Trouble in Paradise. He also wrote Shop Around the Corner. He also worked for Alfred Hitchcock and wrote Suspicion. Miriam Hopkins got top billing of the movie. She was an American actress and very versatile. She signed with Paramount, and Paramount, she made a lot of her movies for Paramount. Even before Trouble in Paradise, she made a great movie called Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. She also received in 1935 an Academy Award for Best Actress for a movie called Becky Sharp. For Lubitsch, she did a movie right after this called Design for Living. And if you enjoyed this at all, please look for Design for Living with Miriam Hopkins and Frederick March and Gary Cooper. And again, a romantic triangle, this time two men and a woman. And of course, this was now after the code came into effect. Edward Everett Horton's in it as well, and quite wonderful. And she also was nominated for The Heiress. But absolutely brilliant actress. To me, she embodied sort of one of the first of these screwball comedy heroines. She just had this feisty, kind of smart edge to her, but, still sweet, still loving, still caring, just charm and wit, and what a perfect role as this, beautiful, jealous pickpocket, right? I love when she is playing the secretary, where she's playing, of course, a Gaston's secretary, and she puts on her glasses. She has these funny little, glasses because she's pretending she's a secretary now. Let's see, that's a great movie too. So, Hopkins was actually considered for It Happened One Night, and she turned the part down. And that's how Claudette Colbert ultimately got cast. Hopkins also auditioned for Scarlett O'Hara. And in fact, she was the only native Georgian who actually auditioned for the part. But of course, Vivien Leigh got that part. And of course, both Colbert and Leigh won Oscars for their performances. And also Miriam Hopkins was one of the pioneers in television. Even in the, 50s, early 60s, she was often appeared in those early live television dramas, obviously, an older woman at the time, but continued working, late into her life, even on television shows like The Flying Nun. Now, Kay Francis is probably not as well known as Miriam Hopkins, but she was, one of the highest paid actresses. She was the #1 female star at Warner Brothers. She grew up very poor, made her way to New York. She had a brief period, in Broadway in the 1920s. And of course, what she's quite famous for, one of her very first films, was with the Marx Brothers. I'm forgetting, was it Animal Crackers or the Coconuts? But she was Coconuts. So she was a great foil for the Marx Brothers, and always, incredibly beautiful, incredibly sophisticated. She was very tall. She was 5'9", think you get a sense of her presence there. And so, when all these New York actors started making their way up to Hollywood, she came with them. She often started with William Powell in the early days. David Selznick was a huge fan of hers and would try to borrow her all the time, even though she was at Paramount. And so she was sort of an obvious choice for this part. And I think she just did a fantastic job. And in fact, watching the film this time, I was even more impressed by her performances. In a way, Miriam Hopkins has the more showy kind of comic performance. But she's very good in this film and very believable and very kind of, you have empathy for her. And again, she's so sophisticated. She's kind of in on this. No one's really making fun of her, taking advantage of her. She kind of knows what's going on here. And anyhow, she was, a huge, covers of film magazines. I thought an interesting statistic in the 1930s, she appeared on the cover of 38 film magazines, which was the most for any adult performer, and only second to Shirley Temple, who appeared in 138 covers during that period. We often forget what a megastar Shirley Temple was. Then in terms of casting Gaston, Cary Grant was actually considered to play the leading part, but he was too young. And Lubitsch wanted, an actor with some experience. Herbert Marshall was 44 years old. And Kay Francis was, in her early 30s. And Grant, although, later on became probably the greatest screwball comedy actor of all time. In fact, we'll be watching The Awful Truth, which was his first big success. But Herbert Marshall got the part, and Lubitsch always really wanted him. And Marshall had a very distinguished career. He was British, of course, and he started in silent film and theater, but a very dramatic thing happened to him, which he actually was in the Western Front during World War I, and was in battle, for over 10 months. And in 1917, he was shot in the left knee by a sniper, and they had to amputate his leg, right? And enormous depression, barely survived, but he did get a prosthetic leg, and he learned how to walk so well that, in fact, I don't know, you could even notice that he has a prosthetic limb in this movie. In fact, he almost, to overcome it, learned to sort of glide along. The only thing he couldn't do is run. So, of course, all those great scenes with that fantastic staircase with him running up and down all had to be shot with a double. But he played against all of the romantic women of the time, Claudette Colbert and Marlene Dietrich and Greta Garbo, everybody, right? His first big film was Blonde Venus in 1932. Same year as Trouble in Paradise. Remember, in those days, these actors would make 5 or 6 movies a year, so that was not an unusual thing. Anyhow, but he was in a lot of pain, and he used to, have like a way to loosen his prosthetic leg when it was discomfort, but somehow he managed to keep going all of these years. And was, obviously wonderful in this film. Supposedly during the 30s, he had affairs with both his Trouble in Paradise co-stars, Kay Francis and Miriam Hopkins, but he had a very serious affair starting in 1934 with Gloria Swanson. And Swanson talks quite a bit about that affair and this handsome man with a gentle face and soft brown eyes and his wonderful musical voice. And he had this great quality that you notice in the, he's always kind of leaning forward a little. It's almost like there's a little bow, or he's always listening, and really you can see why he was such a wonderful lead for some of these great actresses. People love this movie, of course, because Paramount was famous for their glamorous sets and wardrobe and these kind of big budget movies. And of course, this was the height of Art Deco. And so these fantastic sets. And it was the head of Paramount's art department, Hans Dreyer, who was responsible for all of this. And then the extraordinary gowns, very, very, very famous designer named Travis Banton. And as you know, sometimes these gowns became inspiration for, wardrobe and, for popular, popular dresses, in the culture. The supporting characters, I think, were, amazing. Again, Everett Horton, I'm sure you all, recognized him. And he really started in vaudeville. I mean, this guy had an unbelievable career. He probably went on, I think it was over 100 movies he was in, first in the silent era. And this was actually his full and real name, Everett Horton. And his father told him, don't just, because he started off as Edward Horton. And his father said, no, anybody can be Edward Horton, but you be Everett Horton and everyone will remember you. And his most notable characterization, which you saw many times, is he had his own variation of the double take. So lots of actors do double takes, they react to something and then they delay in a more extreme reaction. But he had this incredible quality where he would smile and nod in agreement with what happened. And then the realization would set in. And then his facial features would collapse into this sort of sober, troubled mask. So again, so many great, the front page, lots of the Fred Astaire movies, Top Hat, he's in Holiday, Arsenic and Old Lace, and of course, Designed for a Living. He plays Max Plunkett, one of his greatest roles, which is with Miriam Hopkins, another Ernst Lubitsch movie. Charlie Ruggles, who plays the major, sort of his partner, the lovers of wannabe lovers of Kay Francis. Also had a wonderful comedic career, movies. He made a whole bunch of movies with Mary Boleyn and showed up again in many screwball comedies, Bringing Up Baby, and It Happened on Fifth Avenue. And you may have recognized him because he kept working, many years later into TV. And he had a reoccurring role in Bewitched and the Beverly Hillbillies and things like this. So the movie was very popular, of course, with the critics and the audience. Not necessarily Academy Award winning film, but, at that point, people were more interested in the big dramas. Comedies have always had a bit of a challenge with winning Academy Awards. And as I mentioned, it just sort of disappeared in 1935 because, the production code wouldn't allow this kind of movie to appear where, the heroes are thieves and, and everybody's having sex with each other and nobody's married. But it wasn't until 1958, actually, that it became available again. And Paramount wanted to even make a musical version of this in the 40s and were denied. They said they couldn't do it. Some of the reviews called it as close to perfection as anything I've ever seen in the movies. Everyone called, one of the great top 10 movies of all time, inspired many people, particularly Wes Anderson. If you're familiar with him as a director, he was very inspired by Lubitsch in this movie. And it said this movie was an inspiration for one of his great films, The Grand Budapest Hotel. I'm not sure if you remember that. But another critic, Shirley Trouble, this is the New York Times, Shirley Trouble in Paradise, a picture which is presented at the Rivoli yesterday, points no moral, and the tale it tells is scant and innocuous. Yet, because it is fashioned by the alert-minded Ernst Lubitsch, it's a shimmering, engaging piece of art. It's virtually every scene, the lively imagination of the German director shines forth, and it seems as though he was the only person in Hollywood who could have turned out such an effective entertainment from such a feathery story. So let's go to some of these beautiful pictures that Jeffrey's put together for us, and we can talk a little bit about the movie as we watch some of these slides go by. Okay, so, it really starts right at the beginning, right? Look at this, Solo Mio, and we're in Venice, but what are we looking at? The garbage collector, loading up garbage on his gondola. Now, who thinks about, who picks up garbage in Venice? But Ernst Lubitsch does. And we get, this wonderful, amusing sequence with this, great Italian feeling to it. And of course, on a set in Hollywood, and they're picking up garbage, right? And then it starts, slide 2, please. We see these tracking shots, very good use of camera for talking. Of course, there's no dialogue in any of these shots, so he's back to his silent style. But it reveals, a man has been knocked out and robbed, and then we finally see our hero Gaston, on the balcony. Slide 3, please. And now, of course, here's Miriam Hopkins posing as a countess, and it's quite beautiful how they kind of interact together. Slide 4. You can see he's almost undressing her as he takes off, her coat. And these are all scenes that would never lasted, after the Hays Code. And again, these beautiful gowns, all designed by Banton. And of course, there's that very funny moment where there's a phone call, and it's her roommate, sitting back at their apartment, and she's just using it as a way to play up her importance as a countess. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is just, just such beautiful, again, this is the line we were talking about, when I first saw you, I thought you were an American, but, what a great seductive romantic scene. Then the next slide. Yeah, this is the kind of Lubitsch touch that everyone copies all the time. This whole, the hotel staff is already gossiping about what's going on in rooms 253, 5, 7, and 9. And this becomes like a runner, a running joke as we continue the scene and, continue the movie and who's in those rooms and what are they doing in those rooms. Next slide, please. Yeah, so there, of course, we have Everett Horton. This is the business about the tonsils, and then of course later when he meets Herbert Marshall, he can't quite remember where they knew each other from, and then it all becomes it all becomes clear again. Next slide, please. Oh my God, this guy just is so smooth, so suave, he already, I don't mind. I hope you don't mind if I keep your garter. These guys are just perfectly matched, and you can tell it from the moment. I loved you the minute I saw you. I'm mad about you, my little shoplifter, my sweet little pickpocket, my darling. So we know what's going on between them, and what's about to go on between them. And then in the next slide, of course, we begin to see this beautiful, love scene, and we don't get to see much more. And what do we cut to? Next slide, of course, is Do Not Disturb, which tells us everything about what's going on between them. Okay, so then we sort of switch after this absolutely delicious opening to Paris. Next slide, please. And we get a wonderful introduction to, now we're in Paris, and Colette and Company, and perfume, and that radio ad, and it doesn't matter what you say, it doesn't matter how you look, it's how you smell. But none of this is played for big giant laughs. It's played with sophistication. And of course, glamour and beautiful black and white photography. I mean, many of the, I'm sorry again, you won't be able to see this on the big screen, but this was just a beautifully filmed movie. Next slide. And now, of course, we get to meet Mariette Collet, played by Kay Francis, and her costumes are just fantastic. And right from the beginning, you realize this is a mature, sophisticated woman. She's with her board of directors, but she's not, just someone they're going to push over. She's going to have her own mind. We see, of course, in the next slide, we would see Aubrey Smith. He might be a familiar face to you. He had a great career out of playing, this kind of stoic English member of aristocracy. Of course, here he's playing French, but really doesn't make much of a difference, does it? Same role, same character. And then, of course, later on, there's even a plot point about him. So this is when, you really see how sophisticated these scripts are, instead of just being there for, as a sort of cardboard character. Turns out there's something devious going on, and he has been either stealing money, and of course Herbert Marshall finds out. And next slide, please. Yeah, very, very funny. These two suitors, and they're just sort of a bit of a running joke. But again, they're not just, I don't know what to say. I always feel like, again, they're not just one-note characters. Lubitsch does something to make them seem a little more interesting. Next slide. This is a beautiful moment at the opera. And again, very sophisticated, the use of the binoculars and the iris to, copy the binocular look. He's spying on her. He's got a plan. He sees the bracelet, he sees the purse, the purse, that 125,000 franc purse. I mean, that even, that was very, very, expensive, obviously. But Gaston's a thief, and this is, he prides himself in this, and this is what he's going to do. And then, of course, the next one, the purse is now stolen, and there's a reward. And then they come up with this very clever plan in the next shot, which is, let's return the purse and claim the reward. And maybe Gaston already has an idea that there's more to what he's going to do with this Mariette Colette than just get some money. But look at the intensity on Miriam Hopkins' face. She's just always sharp and and just kind of ready for the next clever thing to happen. Next slide. Yep. So make it out to cash. Now, again, Mariette's no dummy. I don't know that she knows that this guy, actually stole it, but she knows something's going on. She doesn't care. She's attracted to him. He's sophisticated. She knows what she wants from this guy. And, if it's going to cost her some money, that doesn't really matter. Right? Next slide. Yeah, this is the grand staircase. And of course, that's not Herbert Marshall. That's a double, because Herbert Marshall couldn't run, with his, prosthetic leg. So lots of running up and down the stairs and throughout the movie. And again, every screwball comedy would always have these grand staircases and people running up and down the staircases. So, again, you can't say it was directly influenced by this movie, but perhaps it was. Next slide. And this is, of course, more business. Now, of course, there's the butler, Robert Craig, and he was a great actor, always the butler, or the valet, and Animal Crackers, and later Preston Sturges used to use him, Sullivan Travels, just wonderful side characters, always in these movies. Next one. Oh my goodness, look at that gown. Just extraordinary, right? And again, this 5'9" actress who could really wear these gowns. The next one. Yeah, I love this when Willie has to pretend she's the secretary. She puts those funny glasses on, because it makes her look like a secretary. So, so Mariette won't be jealous of her. I don't believe any of it. I think everybody knew what was going on. Next slide. Lots of interesting clocks everywhere, lots of great Art Deco clocks. And again, this business with the doors, right? And who follows through, that his room, her room, he comes out of her room, she comes out of his room. That's a very kind of screwball comedy motif. And you'll see this in other movies as well, where, they go through doors and you get surprised and you're expecting someone coming out of one door and they come out another door. And they always have lots of fun with those kinds of things. And it's a very Lubitsch kind of, Billy Wilder would do things like that all the time as well. Next slide. Yeah, so here's the little side plot, of course, that, Gaston, Giron has done something wrong and Gaston's figured it out. So, or it sort of protects him a little and keeps him out of trouble. But again, it's a plot, it's not just, everything's just not for laughs. Next slide. Yeah, so this, of course, is, when Horton, starts to suspect something about Venice, and Gaston starts talking to him about the harems in Constantinople. But, look how expressive. I mean, these were, again, great silent film actors. So, like Greta Garbo, they really knew how to use their face. And particularly, Everett Horton was one of the best at that. Next slide. Yeah. Again, this is right before they kiss, and look how he's kind of leaning forward a little bit, and Gaston says, "I know all your tricks, and Mariette, and you're going to fall for them." They know exactly what they're doing and why, and so does the audience, and everyone's taking a lot of delight in this. Next slide, please. And then, of course, this is Lily, finding out that they're occupied, and I guess she loves Gaston. I mean, they're two peas in a pod, and she's gonna get her man, that's for sure. Next slide. Oh yeah, beautiful use of the mirror, the love scene. We have years ahead of us, weeks, maybe weeks, months, years. Next slide. Yeah. Again, beautiful pre-code shot, which tells us everything about what's happening. But, we can't see them having sex even in pre-code days, but we know exactly what's going on that bed. Next shot. Yep, and here's, we're coming to the end of the movie, and Willie kind of confronts them, and it's clear that this is all going to end, and hopefully end happily, which of course it does. And of course in the next shot, and of course Gaston, even though he does love her, Mariette, he might have wanted to stay with her, but of course he doesn't. And not only does he head off with Lily, but he even brings the pearls that she desperately, loved, and then the final end of the scene, of course, here they are happily in their taxi cab going off for their next adventure. And one more shot, which will show you Ernst Lubitsch himself smoking his cigar with Kay Francis. You can see she's quite, tall woman, and Herbert Marshall. So anyhow, I hope you really enjoyed this film. Thank you, Jeffrey, as much as I did and Jeffrey did, and love to hear your comments or questions or anything anybody wants to say about the film would be most appreciated. So go ahead, Jeff.
Hey, everyone. Okay, so just switching screens. Jeffrey Eden writes, "Thank you for featuring this movie. I've never seen this before, so really enjoyable. My favorite scene was, 'How's your German?' I'd also never imagined Herbert Marshall as a comic actor."
Yeah, well, that's right. Herbert Marshall wasn't thought of as a great comic actor, but he could do this part. He was made for this part. That's a great comment.
Yeah, and I was wondering, there's so much of this sort of comic language that at times I understand enough Italian, and I could pick up enough Italian in the console scene, but a lot of it was rubbish Italian as well. Like it's almost like a language.
Yeah.
Let's see, Linda Daly. I know you sort of talked about the critical acclaim of the film. Did it have much of a life beyond the 50s, Fred? Did it?
No, again, I can't say this is a well-viewed movie. There are other Lubitsch movies that are seen more often, later films. To Be or Not to Be, 1941, fantastic movie, Carol Lombard and Jack Benny, Designed for a Living. Ninotchka, of course, Greta Garbo. I don't know if it's because it was 1932, it was so early. Also, of course, because no one saw it for all those years, and it was banned. But this is not a movie that you normally see in an art house, theater. And again, there's so many screwball comedies, much better known than, It Happened One Night, and, all those movies, and, Bringing Up Baby, and, Front Page is Girl Friday. So I'm not sure why, because I think, and again, maybe it has this sophistication. It's not quite as screwball-y as some of the screwball comedies. There aren't prank falls and, men running around in dresses and, kind of that silliness that a lot of the screwball comedies had later on. But, so maybe it felt dated. I don't know. I just think it's wonderful. I'm so happy we had a chance to watch it.
Myself as well. Let me see. Mary Scarrett says, beautiful fashions. The movie wasn't corny. The comedy fit the situation. It's hard to believe the movie's almost 90 years old. Wow.
Yeah, 90 years old.
Those fashions are incredible. Travis Banton, you mentioned.
Yeah.
I had read a little bit comment from Edith Head, who said that he was the best in the business and that she learned more from watching him work than any, studio that she would have ever had that experience from. So I thought that was high.
Well, remember, this was Art Deco. This was really the height of the Deco. And Deco's style wasn't just, architecture. It applied to furniture. It applied to clothing. It really applied to, a whole aesthetic of way artists were approaching their work, even paintings, right? So, so it's not surprising that it's there's a classicism that makes it even sometimes feel contemporary, because I think, Deco is still very popular now. I mean, even our movie theater is an Art Deco movie theater from 1935, and you go in there, it doesn't feel dated. It feels very, like, oh my, somebody might design a theater like that today.
Don Rosenthal writes, I loved when Aubrey Smith said, "Don't call me Adolf." It was 1932 after all. Hitler was on his way to power. Don't know if it was a Hitler reference or not, but.
Oh, that's, again, just all those smart little asides, just shows you the sophistication and the time. As I said, Lubitsch, every line of dialogue, every gesture, every shot was so meticulously figured out. Believe me, I've been on a lot of movie sets. It's not like that. They come to the set, the actors walk around, maybe there's a shot list, often not, and then, it's just I don't know. It just was a completely different approach to movie making back then than we see today.
Well, and to that point, Fred, have you been able to draw any comparisons during your career that even came close to trying to emulate this?
When I think of people today working who, I think Wes Anderson is perhaps a good case. When you think about his films, there's an aesthetic that unifies everything in his films. The photography, the production design, the costumes. There's a style of performance that all the actors, if it's Bill Murray or whoever it is, they all sort of fit into that same aesthetic. So that to me is, again, people bandied the word, auteur around, but he strikes me as someone who has that kind of, intellectual conceit to try to do something so unique like that. Sometimes I feel that way about the Coen brothers. I think they're a little more hit and miss, but I think they do manage at times to really create that kind of unifying aesthetic that then unites everything in the film, and you really feel like these guys, really thought this through and really had every detail organized and planned, but done in such a way that you don't feel like claustrophobic, where you're being limited by it or so self-aware of it that you can't just enjoy the film. But I don't know. It's hard to compare. It really is. One of the reasons, of course, is that a lot of directors don't have that kind of control, and they have producers, they have studio executives, they have all sorts of pressure. The actors now have way more control. The actors have a lot to say about what their part is and their dialogue and how they want to do this and where they want to stand. And, the actors didn't have that kind of, even the biggest stars didn't have that kind of control back in the 30s and 40s. They did what the director told them to do. And, when John Ford or, Ernst Lubitsch said, this is how you're going to do it, that's how they did it. It's very, very different now, I think. When you see, in fact, I'll tell you another movie which struck me that had that kind of aesthetic, and why I think it was Parasite. You know, when you think about Parasite and the production design of Parasite and the photography and the performance and the precision of the shots, I think that director knew exactly what he wanted and exactly what he was doing at all times. And everybody, you know, went along with it.
Well, there you go, folks. Cross comparison of Trouble in Paradise to Parasite. You won't hear that on any other film. So that's kind of the end of our comments tonight, unless anybody else had any final questions for Fred. But great talk tonight, Fred. Really loved visiting this film.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. I look forward to seeing you next week. 20th century. I mean, now you're really 1934, right? You're really getting into the more active, you know, kind of screwball comedy. And Carol Lombard, who is, you know, my favorite actress perhaps of all time, and John Barrymore, of course, who you might remember from Grand Hotel, and just so much crazy antics. And again, a love story, you know, in a very sophisticated way. So please join us if you can. Look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you again, Jeff, for all your help.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Bye, everybody.